Henry Willowes had 3 sons and 4 daughters. Everard, the eldest son, married his second cousin, Miss Frances Durfey. She brought some more Willowes property to the Somerset house, a set of garnets, a buff and gold tea service bequeathed her by the Admiral, an amateur of China who had dowered all his nieces and great-nieces with Worcester, Minton, and Oriental, and 2 oil paintings by Italian masters which the younger Titus, Emma's brother, had bought in Rome whilst travelling for his health. She bore Everard 3 children, Henry, born in 1867, James, born in 1869, and Laura, born in 1874. On Henry's birth, Everard laid down 12 dozen of port against his coming of age. Everard was proud of the brewery, and declared that beer was the befitting drink for all classes of Englishmen, to be preferred over foreign wines. But he did not extend this ban to port and sherry. It was clarets he particularly despised. Another 12 dozen of port was laid down for James, and there it seemed likely the matter would end. Everard was a lover of womankind. He greatly desired a daughter, and when he got one, she was all the dearer for coming when he had almost given up hope of her. His delight upon this occasion, however, could not be so compactly expressed. He could not lay down port for Laura. At last he hit upon the solution of his difficulty. Going up to London upon the mysterious and inadequate pretext of growing bald, he returned with a little string of pearls, small and evenly matched, which exactly fitted the baby's neck. Ear by ear, he explained, the necklace could be extended until it encircled the neck of a grown-up young woman at her first ball. The ball, he went on to say, must take place in winter, for he wished to see Laura trimmed with ermine. "My dear," said Mrs. Willowes, "the poor girl will look like a beef-eater." But Everard was not to be put off. A stuffed ermine, which he had known as a boy, was still his ideal of the enchanted princess, so pure and sleek was it, and so artfully poised the small neat head on the long throat. "Weasel!" exclaimed his wife. "Everard, how dare you love a minx?" Laura escaped the usual lot of the newborn, for she was not at all red. To Everard she seemed his very ermine come to true life. He was in love with her femininity from the moment he set eyes on her. "Oh, the fine little lady," he cried out when she was first shown to him, wrapped in shawls, whimpering at the keen sunlight of a frosty December morning. 3 days after that it thawed, and Mr. Willowes rode to hounds, but he came back after the first kill. "'Twas a vixen," he said, "such a pretty young vixen. It put me in mind of my own, and I thought I'd ride back to see how she was behaving. Here's the brush." Laura grew up almost as an only child. By the time she was past her babyhood, her brothers had gone to school. When they came back for their holidays, Mrs. Willowes would say, "Now, play nicely with Laura. She has fed your rabbits every day while you have been at school. But don't let her fall into the pond." Henry and James did their best to observe their mother's bidding. When Laura went too near the edge of the pond, one or the other would generally remember to call her back again. And before they returned to the house, Henry, as a measure of precaution, would pull a wisp of grass and wipe off any telltale green slime that happened to be on her slippers. But nice play with a sister so much younger than themselves was scarcely possible. They performed the brotherly office of teaching her to throw and to catch, and when they played at knights or red Indians, Laura was dutifully cast for some passive female part. This satisfied the claims of honour. If, at some later stage, it was discovered that the captive princess or the faithful squaw had slipped away unnoticed to the company of Brewer in the coach-house, or Oliver Cromwell the toad, who lived under the low russet roof of violet leaves near the disused melon pit, it did not much affect the course of the drama. Once, indeed, when Laura, as a captive princess, had been tied to a tree, her brothers were so much carried away by a series of single combats for her favour that they forgot to come and rescue her before they swore friendship and went off to the Holy Land. Mr. Willowes, coming home from the brewery through a sunset haze of midges, chanced to stroll into the orchard to see if the rabbits had barked any more of his saplings. There he found Laura, sitting contentedly in hay-band fetters and singing herself a story about a snake that had no mackintosh. Mr. Willowes was extremely vexed when he understood from Laura's nonchalant account what had happened. He took off her slippers and chafed her feet. Then he carried her indoors to his study, giving orders that a tumbler of hot sweet lemonade should be prepared for her immediately. She drank it sitting on his knee, while he told her about the new ferret. When Henry and James were heard approaching with war whoops, Mr. Willowes put her into his leather armchair and went out to meet them. Their war whoops quavered and ceased as they caught sight of their father's stern face. Dusk seemed to fall on them with condemnation as he reminded them that it was past their supper time, and pointed out that, had he not happened upon her, Laura would still have been sitting bound to the Bon Chrétien pear-tree. This befell upon one of the days when Mrs. Willowes was lying down with a headache. "Something always goes wrong when I have one of my days," the poor lady would complain. It was also upon one of Mrs. Willowes' days that Everard fed Laura with the preserved cherries out of the drawing-room cake. Laura soon became very sick, and the stable-boy was sent off post-haste upon Everard's mare to summon the doctor. Mrs. Willowes made a poor recovery after Laura's birth. As time went on, she became more and more invalidish, though always pleasantly so. She was seldom well enough to entertain, so Laura grew up in a quiet household. Ladies in mantles of silk or of sealskin, according to the season of the year, would come to call, and sitting by the sofa would say, "Laura is growing a big girl now. I suppose before long you will be sending her to a school." Mrs. Willowes heard them with half-shut eyes. Holding her head deprecatingly upon one side, she returned evasive answers. When, by quite shutting her eyes, she had persuaded them to go, she would call Laura and say, "Darling, aren't your skirts getting a little short?" Then Nanny would let out another tuck in Laura's ginghams and merinos, and some months would pass before the ladies returned to the attack. They all liked Mrs. Willowes, but they were agreed amongst themselves that she needed bracing up to a sense of her responsibilities, especially her responsibilities about Laura. It really was not right that Laura should be left so much to herself. Poor dear Miss Taylor was an excellent creature. Had she not inquired about peninsulas in all the neighbouring schoolrooms of consequence? But Miss Taylor for 3 hours daily, and Madame Prévet's dancing classes in winter, could not, supply all Laura's needs. She should have the companionship of girls her own age, or she might grow up eccentric. Another little hint to Mrs. Willowes would surely open the poor lady's eyes. But though Mrs. Willowes received their good counsel with a flattering air of being just about to become impressed by it, and filled up their teacups with a great deal of delicious cream, the silk and sealskin ladies hinted in vain, for Laura was still at home when her mother died. During the last few years of her life, Mrs. Willowes grew continually more skilled in evading responsibilities, and her death seemed but the final perfected expression of this skill. It was as if she had said, yawning a delicate cat's yawn, "I think I will go to my grave now," and had left the room, her white shawl trailing behind her. Laura mourned for her mother in skirts that almost reached the ground, for Miss Boddle, the family dressmaker, had nice sensibilities and did not think that legs could look sorrowful. Indeed, Laura's legs were very slim and frisky. They liked climbing trees and jumping over haycocks. They had no wish to retire from the world and belong to a young lady. But when she had put on the new clothes that smelt so queerly, and, looking in the mirror, saw herself sad and grown up, Laura accepted the inevitable. Sooner or later she must be subdued into young ladyhood, and it seemed befitting that the change should come gravely, rather than with the conventional polite uproar and fuss of coming out, which odd term meant, as far as she could see, and when once the champagne bottles were emptied and the flimsy ball dress lifted off the thin shoulders, going in. As things were, she had a recompense for the loss of her liberty. For Everard needed comfort. He needed a woman to comfort him, and, abetted by Miss Boddle's insinuations, Laura was soon able to persuade him that her comfortings were of the legitimate womanly kind. It was easy, much easier than she had supposed, to be grown up, to be clear-headed and watchful, to move sedately and think before she spoke. Already her hands looked much whiter on the black lap. She could not take her mother's place. That was as impossible as to have her mother's touch on the piano. For Mrs. Willowes had learnt, from a former pupil of Field, she had the jeu perlé, but she could take a place of her own. So Laura behaved very well, said the Willowes connection, agreeing and approving amongst themselves, and went about her business, and only cried when alone in the potting shed, where a pair of old gardening gloves repeated to her the shape of her mother's hands. Her behaviour was the more important in that neither of her brothers was at home when Mrs. Willowes died. Henry, now a member of the Inner Temple, had just proposed marriage to a Miss Caroline Fawcett. When he returned to London after the funeral, it was impossible not to feel that he was travelling out of the shadow that rested upon Lady Place to bask in his private glory of a suitable engagement. He left his father and sister to find consolation in consoling each other, for though James was with them, and though his sorrow was without qualification, they were not likely to get much help from James. He had been in Germany studying chemistry, and when they sent off the telegram, Everard and Laura reckoned up how long he would take to reach Lady Place, and planned how they could most comfortingly receive him, for they had already begun to weave a thicker clothing of family kindness against the chill of bereavement. On hearing the crunch of the wagonette in the drive and the swishing of the wet rhododendrons, they glanced at each other reassuringly, taking heart at the thought of the bright fire in his bedroom, the carefully chosen supper that awaited him. But when he stood before them, and they looked at his red, twitching face, they were abashed before the austerity of a grief so differently sustained from their own. Nothing they had to offer could remedy that heartache. They left him to himself, and sought refuge in each other's society, as much from his sorrow as theirs, and in his company they sat quietly, like two good children, in the presence of a more grown-up grief than they could understand. James might have accepted their self-effacement with silent gratitude, or he might not have noticed it at all. It was impossible to tell. Soon after his return, he did a thing so unprecedented in the annals of the family that it could only be explained by the extreme exaltation of mind which possessed him. For without consulting anyone, he altered the furniture, transferring a mirror and an almond-green brocade settee from his mother's room to his own. This accomplished, he came slowly downstairs and went out into the stable-yard, where Laura and his father were looking at a litter of puppies. He told them what he had done, speaking dryly, as of some everyday occurrence, and when they, a little timidly, tried to answer, as if they too thought it a very natural and convenient arrangement, he added that he did not intend to go back to Germany, but would stay henceforth at Lady Place, and help his father with the brewery. Everard was much pleased at this. His faith in the merits of brewing had been rudely jolted by the refusal of his eldest son to have anything to do with it. Even before Henry left school, his ambition was set on the law. Hearing him speak in the school debating society, one of the masters told him that he had a legal mind. This compliment left him with no doubts as to what career he wished to follow, and before long the legal mind was brought to bear upon his parents. Everard was hurt, and Mrs. Willowes was slightly contemptuous, for she had the old-fashioned prejudice against the learned professions, and thought her son did ill in not choosing to live by his industry rather than by his wits. But Henry had as much of the Willowes' determination as either his father or his mother, and his stock of it was 25 years younger and livelier than theirs. "Times are changed," said Everard. "A country business doesn't look the same to a young man as it did in my day." So, though a partnership in the brewery seemed the natural destiny for James, Everard was much flattered by his decision, and hastened to put into practice the scientific improvements which his son suggested. Though by nature mistrustful of innovations, he hoped that James might be innocently distracted from his grief by these interests, and gave him a new hopper in the same paternal spirit as formerly he had given him a rook rifle. James was quite satisfied with the working of the hopper, but it was not possible to discover if it had assuaged his grief, because he concealed his feelings too closely, becoming, by a hyperbole of reticence, reserved even about his reserve, so that to all appearances he was no more than a red-faced young man with a moderate flow of conversation.